And we undertook a lengthy examination of the casino contract over that period of time. We had many witnesses appear before the Public Accounts Committee, including those that negotiated the terms of this contract, Mr. Speaker. So this wasn't a surprise to anybody here in this House, except apparently the Minister of Finance. And almost immediately after the HRM bylaw came forward, the Minister of Finance indicated that he was willing to bring forward legislation, and indeed it is contained within this particular piece of legislation to essentially allow the casino operator to escape the HRM bylaw. I mean, and it's ironic, Mr. Speaker, because I'm sure, I feel confident in saying that this is probably the only government on record of bringing forward legislation to allow smoking in a public place. I mean, that's the irony of this piece of legislation. And not only that, I guess what was so stunning about it, Mr. Speaker, was not only that they were prepared to do it, but they were prepared to do it when quite clearly they were wrong in their interpretation of the application of the terms of the contract. And, Mr. Speaker, the term of the contract that the Minister of Finance was so concerned about dealt with the ability of the operator to be able to terminate their agreement. And I'll paraphrase, Mr. Speaker, I won't bother to actually read the clause, but essentially what it said was that in the event that some piece of legislation that should come forward that would materially impair the ability of the operator to operate, or to substantially impair the ability of the operator to operate a first-class casino, the casino operator could give notice, and then after 30 days, if it wasn't repaired, they would be able to terminate their contract. Well, Mr. Speaker, the problem with that, and looking at that piece of the contract in isolation, is that, of course, the first question that has to be answered is how do you determine whether or not the HRM bylaw, as it is promulgated, how do you determine whether or not that would in fact do what the casino operator alleges, which is to somehow impair the ability of the casino to operate? Well, Mr. Speaker, in order to determine that, you have to go to another portion of the contract. And in fact, it's all laid out in Section 9 of the contract. Section 9 of the contract, Mr. Speaker, and you may think that this is not at all related to the people in the gallery or people who are downstairs. I'm sorry, I suppose I shouldn't refer to the people in the gallery, but those interested individuals from the RRSS, you would think that what does the casino contract have to do with those workers? Well, let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, because what's in this contract is binding arbitration, Mr. Speaker. That's what's in this contract. It's good enough for the casino. It's good enough for the casino. It's good enough for the casino operator. And in fact, this was a clause that was insisted upon by the government. They're the ones who made sure that binding arbitration was in the casino contract, because they wanted an orderly way to be able to resolve disputes. Well, that seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to me, Mr. Speaker. And surely to goodness, if it was reasonable when the government signed the contract with the casino operator back in 1995, surely in the year 2003, it is a reasonable thing for us to expect that the workers with the RRSS would be entitled to at least equal treatment as the casino operator and the government would expect. So I wanted to just point out that in all of these things there are a connection. Now, over Over and above that, of course, it's also important just for the reason that it is there, because it demonstrates that the Minister of Finance, in reading the casino contract, read it wrongly, is overreacting by bringing forward a piece of legislation that is unnecessary, and at the very least, the government ought to move its way through the arbitration process that is set out in the contract in order to determine whether or not there's a violation of the contract. And that would be a reasonable thing to do, but very much like its attitude with respect to the RRSS and with respect to many other things like the transition houses, that issue you remember last year, Mr. Speaker, as with Bill 68 and the healthcare workers and the nurses who were forced to strike, as with the paramedics in the first year of the life of this government, as with each one of those items, Mr. Speaker, this government has decided to take a confrontational view, not to exercise discretion and respect, not to come to the table and negotiate in good faith, but rather to play hardball. To play hardball and to say, we have taken a position and we're not prepared to move off it no matter what. Well, Mr. Speaker, you know, if you're the owner of a baseball team in the professional sports, perhaps that's a good strategy, because you're dealing with people who make millions of dollars, and if they go out on strike for a while, you know, they're not, maybe the fans will suffer, but, you know, they'll get by, right? But here, Mr. Speaker, we're dealing with people who every day that they're out on strike, their lives are profoundly impacted for all of the reasons you might expect with respect to economic stress and the stress that it placed on families, Mr. Speaker. And I got to tell you, if one of the problems I think we have is that many people don't understand what a strike is like unless they've actually had to live through one. And if you had to live through one, then you would understand the tremendous stresses that it places on families as they are trying to continue to meet their obligations, whether it's to their financial institution through their mortgage and their car payment, or to their children or to their loved ones. Mr. Speaker, these are obligations that don't end just because a strike is called. And I know only too well that my father was a sheet metal worker, and I remember living through a strike with him when I was very young, and the tremendous stress that placed on our family at that time. And we were lucky enough, as I hope many of these people are, to have good friends and lots of family who were always there to support us and to say, you're doing the right thing, you're in a struggle. You're in a struggle about the quality of your life, and that they would support us in that. And I sincerely hope that that's the case. But it causes a tremendous amount of disruption and stress on people's lives. Now, in this case, Mr. Speaker, it not only does that for the individuals who are involved in the contract dispute, but it also causes a tremendous amount of stress and disruption on the people who are cared for by these individuals. And so, in this case, it's not a strike of convenience, Mr. Speaker. It's a strike of necessity. It's a strike of necessity to ensure that the people who are in those facilities get the care and attention that they require, and that the people who supply that care are treated with the appropriate amount of respect for doing the job that they do. So that may have been a long road to travel, Mr. Speaker, all the way through the casino contract back to here. But to me, when I was reading through this, I couldn't help but be struck by the fact that in the wink of an eye, the Minister of Finance was prepared to put legislation in place to deal with the casino contract that has an arbitration process, and yet wasn't prepared to do anything to facilitate that same process with working people. And that's not the first time, Mr. Speaker. We've seen it in many occasions. Much has been said, Mr. Speaker, about what this budget is about. And for the Minister of Finance and for the members of the government, they like to portray the Financial Measures Act as a way to implement a promise that was made some years ago about tax relief for Nova Scotians. And I think the finance critic for our party ably set out why this is just an illusion, Mr. Speaker, and why it is that the reality of life in Nova Scotia is that next year people will pay more in personal taxes than they did last year. That the minor tax adjustments that are being made by the Minister of Finance will leave out some 300,000 people who will not qualify either for the check that they intend to send out or for the tax relief that they are proposing. All of those people, Mr. Speaker, who will not benefit, I would point out, are those who need it most. The richest person in Nova Scotia, whoever he or she may be, the person that has the largest personal income, and I don't know who it is, but somebody out there holds the distinction of having the highest income in the province. And, you know, that person, whoever it is, will receive a check for $155 and next year will receive a tax break from this government. The poorest person in this province, and I must say, I'm not sure who that is, although I know there are many candidates around us, Mr. Speaker. I don't know who the poorest person is, but I don't want to make light of this because I think it's very, very serious, Mr. Speaker. The poorest person will, as a result of this piece of legislation, they will receive absolutely nothing. They will not get a check from this Minister of Finance. They won't get any benefit from the tax adjustments because they don't make any income. And you know what's going to happen to them, Mr. Speaker? They're going to be sent to the food bank to feed their families. They are going to be treated differently. This is a government that has decided on so many occasions that the road to success is to divide people into categories, just as they have with healthcare workers under Bill 68, as they did with our RSS workers, or are doing now with them, as they have done with many others, is to try and divide them off and defeat them individually. And, Mr. Speaker, the roots of this strategy run right back to the last election when they were pitting the mainland voters against those in Cape Breton. Well, Mr. Speaker, in this instance, this government has decided to divide people by income. And they have said some people who make money, some people who make a certain income are more valuable to us in the sense that we are going to confer a benefit on them, but not on other citizens of this province. And whether or not that is the intended result of the Financial Measures Act, it is the actual result, because there are 300,000 people in this province who will not only not receive a tax break, but who next year, because of the increases in personal taxes, and those take many forms, Mr. Speaker, will actually pay more. And whether they're paying it because they have to get in their car to try and go to work, or to go to, for that matter, to a doctor's appointment, or to pick up groceries or whatever it is, they're going to pay more in motor fuel taxes. They are going to pay more, Mr. Speaker, next year in motor vehicle charges. They're going to pay more in many, many, many categories. The HST revenue in this province next year is going to go up. Mr. Speaker, I don't know what it was like in your neighborhood, but in my neighborhood, my neighbors were telling me that when they got their oil bill this year and they looked at the portion of it that was HST, they just couldn't believe it. But of course, the reality is that as the price of oil goes up, because HST is based on a percentage, the amount you pay in tax goes up as well. So this government reaps a windfall off of the increases in the cost of gas and in the cost of home heating oil. On the increases in electricity. But this is not the only way that government picks your pocket, this government in particular. This is the government that brought in the 911 fees. Mr. Speaker, you every time you get your phone bill, and you may remember that the cost of setting up the 911 system was estimated at somewhere in the vicinity, I think at the time the minister was telling us the changes were going to cost them somewhere in the vicinity of $1 million at the time. The tax, Mr. Speaker, was going to bring in $7 million. So it was just a tax grab out of the pockets of the people of Nova Scotia. That's all it was then when it was introduced, and it is what it is today. So people are going to continue to pay more in tax. And it's one of the reasons why I haven't really understood the position of the Liberal Party, mainly because
it'll change tomorrow.
Mainly because this is not a tax break budget. And you shouldn't go about telling people that it's a tax break budget. It's not. You're going to pay more. You're going to pay more in personal taxes next year than you paid this year. And
another honourable member on his feet. I believe the member for Cape Breton West is on a point of order.
Yes. Well, perhaps
Cape Breton West.
Well, perhaps, Mr. Speaker, if ask the honourable member if he could give me some clarification on his observation there. Is he suggesting the Liberal caucus is saying it's a tax break budget? Is that what he's saying? I don't know anybody in this caucus that came to that conclusion.
Order, please. The intervention by the Honourable, the member for Cape Breton West, does not meet the terms and conditions of a point of order. However, the Honourable, the Leader of the Opposition, certainly can provide more clarity if in fact he so chooses.
No, Mr. Speaker, I guess... Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My point is this. The Liberals stand up and say, we are going to oppose the Tory tax cut, and we are going to oppose it because it is harsh and unfair and benefits disproportionately people in this province, which is true. Say, this is why we're going to oppose it, right? Now, then they say, this, of course, is unlike the Liberal tax cut that came down a couple of years ago, which, although harsh and disproportionately benefits the rich in society, was compassionate, Mr. Speaker. Well, I think you have to draw a pretty long bow to get to that conclusion. You know, so that's why I don't understand how they draw a difference, because in my mind, Mr. Speaker, it is a distinction without a difference. But you know something, Mr. Speaker, it doesn't really matter, because as I pointed out when we started out, this whole thing is just an illusion. There are going to be a minor adjustment in the tax rate, which is going to give back to some people some of what the government has taken. That is the net result of the Financial Measures Act, Mr. Speaker. And I want to point that out because the estimate-to-estimate increase in the revenue of this government is going to go up by something like $250 million this year, somewhere in that vicinity. So what the government is undertaking in no way impairs the ability of a future government to implement the kinds of reforms that ought to be made. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't impair the ability of a future government, for example, to give HST relief, to take the HST off of home heating oil and electricity and children's medication and the necessities of life. You know, a tax break that would actually be meaningful to people. It doesn't impair that. It doesn't impair the ability of a future government, Mr. Speaker, to be able to deal with the question of long-term care and to say to the seniors of this province, just because you get elderly and ill does not mean that you should have to sacrifice everything that you have worked your lifetime for in order to pay for health care that everybody else gets as part of the publicly paid Medicare system. Mr. Speaker, these measures do not impair the ability of a future government to actually fix that system, and not in the way as suggested by the government opposite that says that we have to wait and that seniors in this province have to wait until the year 2007 before they are entitled to relief. Mr. Speaker, and I pointed out before, if one of us were to end up in the emergency room and we got into the emergency room and the nurses or doctors who were there said, I'm sorry, Mr. So-and-so, you're going to have to go away, but if you come back in 2007, we'll provide this service to you free of charge. Now, if that actually happened, Mr. Speaker, I think anybody would would consider themselves to be fairly harshly done by. And of course it doesn't happen, Mr. Speaker, but it does happen to seniors who have to go to long-term care facilities, because if they're not prepared to sacrifice everything they have to pay for those costs, they are not allowed in a long-term care facility. Do you know that, Mr. Speaker? You know that they are not accepted into a long-term care facility unless they are prepared to go through the assessment process and accede to the demands of the government that they give up everything they've worked their life for. So, Mr. Speaker, a tremendously unfair system perpetuated by this government, but not outside the reach of a reasonable government, given the reasonable resources of this province. Another reason why my colleague pointed out that this whole budget was an illusion around the tax cut was because there are many things that just don't appear on the books of the province, Mr. Speaker. For example, and I think this is a very relevant thing for us to think about. For example, the deficit in school maintenance. Right across this province, Mr. Speaker, I think there are 466 schools from one end of this province to the other, and they require more than $500 million in maintenance. This is deferred maintenance, Mr. Speaker, maintenance that needs to be done but hasn't been done. And I think those figures came forward through an audit with the Auditor General. So it's not a figure we've made up. It's not something we're saying. This is something that comes from the Auditor General, who says that there's a deficit of $500 million that should be on the books of the province that is in deferred maintenance in our schools. And the longer we wait to do something about fixing up those schools, Mr. Speaker, the worse it's going to get. And you know what's interesting? And I don't blame the government for being shy about this, but the reality is that if they are going to do the appropriate renovations, do the appropriate maintenance to those schools, I think we're all under the impression, and I think quite rightly, that what you see in terms of the debt that goes on the books of the province is money that is being used for capital infrastructure. Now, the reality is, although I think most people understand this, you're buying a capital asset, it's unlikely that you're going to pay for it all in 1 year. When you buy a capital asset that's going to last you 25 years, like your house, Mr. Speaker, you put down a down payment on it, and then you pay your monthly mortgage payments, and over 20 years you pay off the mortgage, and that's very much the way that infrastructure works within the province. But you know something? There is a better way to do it than simply going out on the money markets and saying we need to borrow X number of millions of dollars in order to build the infrastructure in our province. You know, Mr. Speaker, in Manitoba has a public auto system. That is a way to provide to the people of Manitoba at a reasonable cost the compulsory auto insurance product that they are required to have in order to be able to be on the streets and roads of Manitoba. And you say, well, what does this have to do with the province and their ability to borrow money? Well, Mr. Speaker, over the years, the Manitoba Public Insurance Corporation has managed to build up a reserve of $1.3 billion, Mr. Speaker. And that's money that, of course, they need to invest because they need to have investment income as well. They're not just going to set on that money, they're going to invest it. So where do they invest it, Mr. Speaker? Well, they invest 46.5% of it with the Manitoba government. Mr. Speaker, $595 million of that premium pool is invested right back in the province of Manitoba through bonds that support infrastructure, community infrastructure, like schools, like health care. Those facilities are financed right within the capital pool that exists within the province. So rather than having the interest on that money paid by the people of Manitoba going to shareholders around the world or outside of the province, it remains within the province of Manitoba. Now, this is something that the government opposite could do. They could do that. And they're right in this, to say that this would not be an immediate benefit, Mr. Speaker, but it would be a long-term benefit that would add to the ability of the province to manage their debt. It would be a progressive step, Mr. Speaker, in help capture the interest that we pay on debt that otherwise just goes out of the province. And we've provided this advice to the government now on numerous occasions, and I was pleased to hear the minister responsible for skyrocketing insurance premiums say today that this is part of the debate. Some people say that there ought to be a driver-owned, publicly owned system, and he said some people don't say. Well, that supposes that there is, in fact, an actual debate that's going on within the government around whether or not we ought to have an independent, not-for-profit auto insurer. The problem, of course, Mr. Speaker, is I don't actually think that that's true. If you look at the documentation put out by the government, they never mention an independent, not-for-profit public auto insurer, not once. And in fact, it was specifically excluded from the documents prepared by the minister responsible for skyrocketing insurance premiums when he published The Road Ahead, which is the document that they asked the people of Nova Scotia to read. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to yield the floor at this point in time, and I know that there's much more that could be said and probably will be said before this debate is over, but I wanted to have the opportunity to add my voice to that of many others who have spoken out in opposition to the Financial Measures Act and in favor of a better Financial Measures Act that would have adequately assisted the people of this province. So, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for the opportunity to join the debate.
Thank you. The Honourable, the member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And there's so much competition to get up to speak on this, and I think that as I was getting ready to take my seats, I noticed some movement on the other side on the government benches, and I'm not sure if that was them waking up or getting ready to get to their feet to speak on this legislation, because surely to heavens, Mr. Speaker, somebody on the government benches are going to get up, some of them are going to get up and speak, not just write columns, but are actually going to get up to speak on this legislation. And the member from Kings North says that he already spoke about it, Mr. Speaker. That was the day I think I ended up getting a headache and having to leave just as he was speaking, because the topic was how this tax break was going to be economically stimulating for the province and also bring social justice or something like that, Mr. Speaker, which I had some grave difficulty comprehending, given the fact that those who are in this province who are the most disadvantaged, which, of course, a member from Kings North from his former profession should understand their plight. Those people, Mr. Speaker, are going to get absolutely zipped. But I thought that there would be some members on the government benches who would be anxious to get up and try to defend this election budget, or this election, and that's really what this is part of, Mr. Speaker, is the budget. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I begin, I want to tell you a true story.
All your stories are true.
All of them, of course, are true, yes. But this happened actually this morning. While I was standing in the garage in Sackville this morning, getting my car, which is ailing a little bit, getting it assessed to find out what exactly was wrong with it, not being overly mechanically inclined myself, Mr. Speaker. I want somebody who is very capable, and there's a garage that I go to that does excellent work, and finding out what exactly was wrong with it. But during the course of my stay there, I happened to meet and get involved in a conversation with another gentleman who was in there having his car repaired. And what came up, of course, were several issues related to politics. One was insurance rates. And another one was, apparently he read something in the paper about what I had said last week about this budget, in which I called it the glass turkey budget. And he said, you know, that it reminds him of the days when he was younger, and he was working for, and I won't name the company, but it was involved in construction. And this gentleman was an engineer. And he pointed out, Mr. Speaker, that at Christmas time, the company that he worked for gave to all of the management and the engineers a turkey for Christmas. But that those who were the laborers, those who received the least pay, they received nothing. They weren't given the Christmas turkey bonus that was given to the management, Mr. Speaker, or to the engineers and the higher-ups in the company. So that gentleman said, it reminds him, this government reminds him of that company. They are giving something to those who need it less than to those who need it most. And Mr. Speaker, that's really what this is all about. Mr. Speaker, I said before, and I'm still going to stand beside it, or behind it, I should say. I think that the election in Nova Scotia is going to be held on June the 17th. And I say that, Mr. Speaker, because I believe that the $155 checks will be in the mail on June the 13th. That's a Friday. Those checks should start arriving in people's mailboxes, therefore, the following Monday and Tuesday. And therefore, those people who receive the check, I can't say the government's trying to bribe them, because you know, Mr. Speaker, you would rule, if I said the government was trying to bribe them, you'd rule that out of order. So I wouldn't say that. But what I would say, and hopefully this is politically correct, the government is trying to curry the favor of certain voters by having a check arrive in their mailboxes. And those approximately 300,000 Nova Scotians, those who are of the lowest incomes, those people, for example, seniors who receive the annual supplement, those, Mr. Speaker, as the Minister of Finance knows, those who work for the minimum wage in Nova Scotia, which is grossly inadequate, and even with the very modest increase that is supposed to be starting after the next election, it's still going to be woefully inadequate. Those people are going to be earning so little money that they won't be paying Nova Scotia income tax. Therefore, they will get zero. And what the government wants to do is to have the vote being held when the checks are in the mail and going out, so that those who get the checks are going to be happy, and those who haven't gotten them, let's say by the Tuesday, will be believing the check's in the mail and will get it on Wednesday or Thursday. Now, some people might say that I'm a little bit cynical. But that's what being in here sometimes for a period of time causes one to become. You know, Mr. Speaker, I haven't spoke with one individual. Literally, I can say quite honestly, not with one single person who has suggested to me that they will vote Tory because of that $155 check. I haven't spoken with one single individual who has said to me, outside of the Tory caucus benches or Tory staff, not one who has said that they believe that this is a government fulfilling an election promise to give a tax break. Not one. But, Mr. Speaker, I have spoken with many people who have told me that they see it and believe it, and hopefully this isn't out in parliamentary, because what I'm doing is reporting what I was told. Mr. Speaker, what they said, they see it as a crass attempt by this government to buy their vote. That's what they have said to me. And I haven't had one of those people who told that to me say that they wanted that money. They said that all of them said that there are better ways to spend that money. $155. Now, Mr. Speaker, let's just on a few things, figure out what we could do with that. Let's just take the workers who are outside and downstairs. Workers who work in the small option homes across this province. The people who are outside who are on strike work in the RRSS in Metro. And we have other workers doing similar jobs to what they do across this province. Working with the most vulnerable members of our society, the mentally and physically handicapped, Mr. Speaker. They do a job that I hazard to say I couldn't do. I don't know how many members in this legislature could do it. And the government is saying we can't afford to go to the table. Because, Mr. Speaker, if we provide a fair wage offer to those who work for RRSS, we'd have to provide fair wages to people right across the province who work in the same business, Mr. Speaker. Well, what would that cost? Cost about $5 million. About $5 million. So, $5 million off of $68 million that you're planning to send out, Mr. Minister, leaves you $63 million left. You'd have to take $10 or $12 off of that glass turkey that you're sending out, Mr. Speaker. That's $68 million. And the Minister of Finance had actually caused me to have some encouragement before. Because the Minister of Finance had said that there wasn't necessarily going to be a straight across the board 10% income tax cut this year. Well, he followed through on that, because the $155 check, of course, doesn't work out to a 10% for everybody. It's about 10% for 6 months of the total income tax pie, but certainly it's not across the board for everybody. But he indicated in some of his earlier interviews, he seemed to be waffling a little bit or deviating, that maybe the break might come in some other ways rather than an income tax cut. And I got to admit, I wasn't expecting him to send us a glass turkey. I wasn't expecting, the old days, there were flasks, there were Mickeys, there were nylons, there were chocolates given out at election time. I wasn't expecting the minister to be sending out checks that would be enough to buy people a Texas Mickey, or a glass turkey, as I'm used to calling them. But Mr. Speaker, there are other ways that money could have been used that would have been very helpful, that would have helped to build the infrastructure in this province, and that I think the Nova Scotians, I feel quite confident, would have supported. Just as an example, you could have provided a half-decent wage increase, Mr. Speaker, for those who work for the RRSS, and provided parity across the province for all other workers. You could have taken another $20 million and put that into education to meet the special education needs for children in our schools who have learning disabilities and who we are failing year in, year out, so that those children would have had a chance to maximize your educational opportunities and to become productive in society, as productive as they could be. But the members on the Tory benches, the member from Preston, the member from Pictou East and Pictou Centre, Digby, Chester St. Margaret's, they've obviously decided that those workers and that those children are not as worthy and don't have as high a priority as sending out your glass turkey checks at election time. You are making that decision, each and every one of you on those Tory benches. You're making that decision. You know, if they'd given that $5 million, give or take a few dollars, Mr. Speaker, and I'm just throwing that figure out, that's probably high. And if you had put $20 million into the special education fund that is desperately needed, you still would have had $43 million with which to do something. That could have done a whole bunch of things. For the member from Hants West, the government house leader, former transportation minister, he would know that that $43 million would have been enough to twin another 43 kilometers of Highway 101, Mr. Speaker. Saving lives, improving infrastructure, all of those things that I've mentioned, and there are many other options as well. Improve the either physical or human infrastructure in this province. But they have chosen not to do any of those things. Mr. Speaker, if they didn't want to do some of those things, they could have taken the HST off of home heat fuel. But of course, the Minister of Finance, he wouldn't be too keen on that. Because you know, this winter, when the families, today's families in Nova Scotia were being killed by the higher heating costs, the Minister of Finance was wringing his hands in glee and dancing. Sugar plum fairies were dancing in his head as the loonies and the toonies flowed into his coffers from the higher HST he was collecting on that home heat oil. Nova Scotia families were suffering, and the government of Nova Scotia, the Tories, were profiting. And Mr. Speaker, that's a shame. The government could have agreed and could have set up a way to compensate those Nova Scotia families instead of having them profiteering off of their disadvantage. They could have done something to help those families who were deciding, Mr. Speaker, will they feed themselves and their children, or will they have some heat in their homes? But, Mr. Speaker, they're more anxious to get their loonies and toonies. Mr. Speaker, that's wrong. The government could have, with that money, instead of saying wait till the next election, because you notice it's 2007, I think it is, 2007. They say that they're going to be taking care of the health care costs for those seniors and others who are in long-term care facilities, because they just don't have the money for it, Mr. Speaker. They can't do it all at once because it takes time. So between now and 2007, they're going to strip away the assets that families have worked their lives to build up to pay for health care costs that nobody else pays for unless you're in a long-term care facility in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. But you know what? without touching the tax break that is coming next January, that $68 million fund could have taken care of those health care costs now, could have provided the monies that are necessary to get a fair settlement at the table for those who work in these small option homes, and, Mr. Speaker, put $20 million into the funds to help children with special learning difficulties in the school. And Nova Scotians would have understood that. And, Mr. Speaker, I think that if you were to ask Nova Scotians, the vast majority of them would say that they would be very happy. They would have preferred to see that money going to help those. But instead, those who are living with the supplement, those who are disabled, on low incomes, those who are working at or just slightly above the minimum wage, many of them, Mr. Speaker, raising or trying to raise a family, trying to raise children, facing these higher heating costs, they'll get nothing. They'll get absolutely nothing. Tory priorities. I'd like to ask a member from Queens, are those your priorities? Would you rather have $155 in your pocket, or would you rather have those who are in your community that you were elected to represent be able to afford to have heat in their homes, and the children in the schools to be able to get the resources that they need? Surely that's not a difficult question to answer. I don't know who's taken over the premier. Has some alien from Ontario, from the old Mike Harris team, come down and possessed him? I'm being told it's Donald Rumsfeld. Well, maybe. But it's the politicos, the political masters who are seen to be pulling the strings. They're the puppet masters now overall. Because the main thing that counts is election strategy. And I hear members on the government benches, I won't name them, Mr. Speaker, but when announcements are made, they make comments like, well, they're asked by the media and others, say, now, is this being prompted by the soon-to-be announced election? And the members say, oh, look, people say that, ask me that all the time. And of course the answer is no. This has nothing to do with the election. And I want them to give profiles when they make those statements, because I want to see how much their nose is growing, Mr. Speaker. Because anybody who thinks for 1 minute, that the premier and others who are traveling around this province, I should say, making these grandiose announcements on the eve of the election, to think that they have nothing to do with the election, Mr. Speaker, come on. I mean, hey, some of us, Mr. Speaker, may be a little bit naive and gullible. I mean, heck, obviously quite a few of us were, because Tories got elected. So obviously there were a lot of gullible people out there. But those who were born yesterday can't vote. And if the Tories really think that anybody is so gullible as to believe that all these announcements that are being made, almost all of which are in the future, somewhere's out there on the horizon, they might conceivably happen next fall, or in a year or 2 years or 3 years. It's a litany of so-called good intentions, while real issues that you could be dealing with now are left unattended. Mr. Speaker, nobody for a minute believes that it has nothing to do with the election. It's like the old days the stories were, and maybe it's not the old days, the Tories are back. But you know, they used to have, as the elections were taking place, companies would be hired to go out and park your equipment on the side of a road. You put a grader out there, you stick up a sign, says construction work, you know, whatever, zone, and you have a grader sitting there, and it looks like, you know, you might even go along and pay somebody to stick some signs in like survey stakes. The vote is held, and the day after, the equipment is recalled to the depots. But the message was there, vote for us and we're going to pave. We're going to do that work? Yeah, right, Mr. Speaker. We had the minister as my colleague, and hopefully for Nova Scotia's sake, the next premier of this province. He refers to the government House leader as the minister responsible for skyrocketing insurance rates. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the Minister of Finance, as those rates continue to go through the roof, depriving many Nova Scotians the ability to operate a vehicle, meaning, Mr. Speaker, also that many Nova Scotians who would have a very legitimate claim for insurance because of damage that was done, saying, no way am I going to claim that $2,000 or $3,000 accident, because if I do, my insurance is going to go up by close to that amount a year. But the Minister of Finance, of course, is racking in with every increase more in the way of tax dollars, Mr. Speaker.
4% tax.
4%. So, I don't know what that works out to, Mr. Speaker, but let's say, as we figured it out, we do know that from the time that the government finally followed the advice given to it by this caucus and referred the insurance issue to the Utilities and Review Board, from that February 1st of 2002 to February of this year, rates in Nova Scotia went up by 66%. And Mr. Speaker, when those rates went up by 66%, remember, the rates are 66% higher. So the province of Nova Scotia, the Minister of Finance, is collecting 4% more on that 66% increase. And I don't know, Mr. Speaker, I don't have, what do you call it, the Ouija board to do the math, the calculation?
Ouija board.
Not the Ouija board, no. What do you call that little? No, well, you got a calculator. I'm trying to think of one. Abacus. Yeah, what do you call it again?
Abacus.
Abacus, yeah.
Oh, you were right first.
Abacus, Mr. Speaker.
Not the Ouija board.
I heard somebody over there woke up. You know, when you get, into, you know, that's what's fun about this. Sometimes, Mr. Speaker, you can actually get them going. Yeah, I obviously was following the Minister of Finance. He uses the Ouija board to do his budgets. Mr. Speaker, it's called the Dreaming Board, right? Something like that. Dreamer's Board, Mr. Speaker. But the reality is,
Spirit World, where he gets his number.
that's a lot of dollars. And so the Minister of Finance has been collecting this additional 4% on that 66% increase rate, putting it in his pocket, and shoving in that little special account so that you can turn around at election time to write checks, and I'm sure he won't write them himself. If maybe the Premier is going to fire the Minister of Finance and take over the Minister of Finance job before the election, because then he can put his signature on the checks, but even that might be even a little bit too crass for the Premier.
Neil's signature be on them.
Mr. Speaker, so they can turn around and pretend they're giving something back.
He goes out the door.
Home heat fuel, everything that's going up. Look at what's happened to licenses and fees in this province. Approximately $300 million more that this government has been taking out of the pockets of each and every individual Nova Scotian who purchases anything, gets a driver's license, gets a motor vehicle registration, buys a fishing license, you name it, they take it.
Seniors who want to dangle the line. pay a fee.
So they're doing that, Mr. Speaker. And then they're pretending that they're giving money back equally? Well, you know, if somebody goes in for a driver's license and you're somebody who's working and making $6 an hour, that driver's license costs you as much as if you're making $60 or $160 an hour. If you have to buy 200 gallons of oil and you're making $6.50 or $10 an hour, it costs you as much as if you're making $100 an hour at your place of employment, Mr. Speaker. But you know, it sure takes a much bigger bite out of your wallet as a percentage if you're making $6 an hour or $10 an hour or $20 an hour than it does if you're making $100 an hour. So, Mr. Speaker, those kinds of taxes, those kinds of fees don't treat Nova Scotians equally. People from rural Nova Scotia should know that. The member from Guysborough, Port Hawkesbury should know that you have a lot of people in your constituency who are hurting. You know that better than I do. You know the unemployment rate there.
Town of Canso, under great stress.
Communities like Canso, as my leader reminds me, under tremendous stress. How many of the people in that town are going to receive the $155 check? You can go, Mr. Speaker, I can assure you, into my community, and I can take you into neighborhoods where people are very proud, they are working, they are struggling, often working 1 and 2 jobs, trying to raise a family. But you know what? Because of circumstances, economic situations, circumstances that they can't easily alter, they're not making high wages. They often contribute tremendously in the community, volunteering and helping, but they don't make enough money, Mr. Speaker, to be able to get back the government's check. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance. I'm not going to insult the Minister of Finance this time, Mr. Speaker, but just put it this way. The Minister of Finance has within his department some very capable, credible staff members who, if the Minister of Finance were to give them the directions, could come up with a scheme that would provide genuine relief to Nova Scotians.
I don't know, we had enough scheming.
And do that in a way that would bring maximum benefit. Could be done. If the political will is there. It may not mean a check in the mail, but it may curry a lot more favor from Nova Scotians than the check in the mail that some will get, and others will get nothing. I throw the challenge to the Minister of Finance. Go back and speak to your staff. Ask them if they could come up with a plan, a program that would do that. And it's not, Mr. Speaker, as if we don't have money in this province, and we talk all the time about the deficit and the debt. And Mr. Speaker, let's not kid anybody. The debt in this province is very real. And it certainly, Mr. Speaker, is something that Nova Scotians must have a handle on. But one of the things, certainly, Mr. Speaker, one of the ways that debts are paid off is by growing the economy. And so that the amount of the dollar, the total debt value, may not go down, but if the earnings go up as a proportion of your net income, the debt shrinks. And that basically is the way that the federal debt, which had been so large after World War II, was paid off. It wasn't actually paid off, it just shrank as a percentage of the GNP for Canada. Or GDP.
Debt to GDP ratio.
And you know, Mr. Speaker, the economy of Nova Scotia is growing. The revenues will increase. And as the leader of New Democrat Party said, Mr. Speaker, a little bit earlier, and hopefully I say the next premier of this province said a little earlier, the revenue projections for the province are expected to grow by $250 million. So that's in next year. So we do have room to assist today's Nova Scotia families. We do have that opportunity.
Order, please. Order, please. We welcome our guests to the gallery, but obviously we don't. We appreciate that they not respond to your positivity or negativity that's happening on the floor, please. Thank you. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And while I am very sympathetic to the message that they're trying to bring forward, Mr. Speaker, and may wish myself to repeat that outside, I know that we can't do that inside the House, Mr. Speaker, and therefore, Mr. Speaker, I won't go there at this point in time. But as I said earlier, there is more than plenty of room if the government wished to resolve the impasse that is taking place right now, an impasse that is occurring simply because the government refuses to accept the responsibility and go to the table. Mr. Speaker, and I want to go this way first of all. And I've heard the Premier, I've heard the Minister of Community Services, and I've heard other Tory members go out and spout the Tory line. You know, you get these briefing notes, and these are the lines that you're supposed to spin when you're asked questions. I'm sure the member from Sackville-Beaverbank will bring them my regrets that I can't come in at the moment. Thank you very much for reminding me that they're coming. They're here. Mr. Speaker, the line that is being used is that we cannot interfere with the collective bargaining process. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is from the same bunch. The same ones who had so much respect for the collective bargaining process that we sat here 24 hours a day, day after day after day, to pass legislation to do away with collective bargaining for healthcare workers. This is the same bunch, Mr. Speaker, that did the same kind of thing to the paramedics in this province.
Long history, though. Go right back to
So, Mr. Speaker, don't give us, don't insult the workers who are outside, or don't insult Nova Scotians, members of the Tory caucus, by going out there and saying this has something to do with you respecting collective bargaining. Because, Mr. Speaker, that's hogwash. I could put it a little bit stronger, but not in here. And I don't want to take my seat yet, Mr. Speaker, which you would probably tell me to do if I were to really tell you in the kind of graphic terms what I think. And you know, Mr. Speaker, those healthcare workers, after all of the bully tactics used by this government to railroad that legislation through, many of them were NSU members too, Mr. Speaker. What did the government decide to do? Oh, let's solve it. Let's go to arbitration.
like casino contract has an arbitration clause.
Teachers in this province, we're at an impasse with this government over things like wages. What did the government do? Offered arbitration.
Right.
Those who work in the community colleges, arbitration. Novel. But you know, the government now somehow doesn't believe in arbitration. And they, you know, Mr. Speaker, they say, well, you go back and meet with your employer. Do you know, Mr. Speaker, healthcare workers don't work for the Minister of Health. Never did.
District Health Authority.
They have another employer. It's called the District Health Authorities. Funded by the province. And who do you think funds RRSS? They don't go and spend $2 in the lottery hoping to win the jackpot to get money to pay these people, Mr. Speaker. They're paid by the Treasury of Nova Scotia. They're a non-profit organization hired to provide this service, getting all of their funding from the province of Nova Scotia. Teachers don't work for the Minister of Education. They're not hired by them.
School boards.
It's individual school boards across this province. Province is involved in negotiations. But you know, Mr. Speaker, as the Minister of Tourism and Culture will know, like myself, a former teacher, that, Mr. Speaker, you're employed by a school board. If the province has nothing to fear, if they believe that the wage offer that is on the table and the benefits that are being offered is fair, why wouldn't you go to arbitration? In fact, the refusal of this government to be willing to take it to arbitration is an admission on your part that you believe you're lowballing them. That's an admission. But obviously you're considering, well, there aren't that many people involved, and you're not overly concerned about the workers, and obviously, and this I say with a heavy heart, you're obviously not concerned about those very vulnerable residents who are in their care, and who, many of whom have now had to be institutionalized or to taken home into families that are just struggling to cope. There is absolutely no reason for this to be continuing and going on if you genuinely believe in the collective bargaining process. They're not just out there on strike saying we want more wages. They're saying sit down and negotiate and go to arbitration. It's not a gun to the government's head saying give us absolutely a certain amount. They want to go to arbitration. It's very different. And I say to the members on the government benches, and yes, indeed, those in the galleries, those outside and those downstairs are focusing their attention. The names of the Minister of Community Services and the Premier are the ones who are foremost off their lips. But the truth is, each and every one of the Tory caucus members bears equal responsibility. Each and every one of you, the member from Chester St. Margaret's, you can go to the Premier and say, I want this settled at arbitration. And you could tell the people that I am going to go to the Premier and say, I want it settled by binding arbitration. He doesn't have to listen to you, but you can make the commitment and make a public stand, public statement that that's what you believe. As can the member from Annapolis, as can the member from Queens, as can the member from Halifax Bedford Basin. Each and every one of you can do that. and should do that, in my opinion. It's not just the Premier or the Minister of Community Services. Each and every one of you bears an equal responsibility because each and every one of you are members of government. And that's something, Mr. Speaker, that the members of the Tory benches may not realize, but the people outside, downstairs, and in our galleries, they do. And it's not only their votes you're going to lose. What concerns me tremendously, unless there is going to be better treatment being given to these people, hardworking, extremely challenging job, requiring tremendous patience and skill and constant upgrading, we're going to lose them. And more importantly, our residents are going to lose them. Because, like us in here, they also have families. They also have to be concerned about their loved ones, their children's future. They also, Mr. Speaker, want to be able to put food on the table of their children, for their children, I should say. They also, Mr. Speaker, are facing those obscene insurance rates that are being charged. And the higher taxes on HST and the fuel and all these other things and fees that this government keeps cranking up. And Mr. Speaker, we have young, by and large, young and enthusiastic people working in these facilities. And I am very much afraid we will lose these dedicated people. Not because they don't want to do what they're doing, but honestly, they will just feel they cannot continue. But you know, when the casino snaps its fingers, the Tories jump. The Liberals, and Mr. Speaker, I don't think that there is any piece of legislation that I spoke more on in opposition to was the casino legislation, the one-armed bandit bill introduced by the Liberals when they were in power. As they had visions of this, you know, we're supposed to have all kinds of tourists, all kinds of high rollers flying in from all around the world to be putting their loonies and toonies in the slot machines down on the waterfront. Of course, that hasn't happened. What they've been doing, of course, is taking money out of the pockets of Nova Scotians, many of whom have become, unfortunately, addicted. So much of the grandiose scheme that we were sold, or that we tried to be sold, I didn't buy it, so I can't say they sold it on me, that the Liberals of the day and now say, well, that was a different time and a different government, and we really, you know, shouldn't be judged by what we did or what the Liberals did a few years ago. But that was supposed to be this great savior. Now, Mr. Speaker, apparently the city of Halifax and the city, the community, I should say, because they aren't cities anymore, we got amalgamated by the Liberals too, so we got Hermed in Halifax, HRM, and in Cape Breton, of course, Cape Breton Regional Municipality, they have introduced anti-smoking legislation. How radical. They must be terrorists, Mr. Speaker, to be concerned for the well-being and the health of the citizens. They've introduced legislation that bans smoking in public places. Of course, it's been in place for almost 2 years in Cape Breton. Tories didn't seem to notice it, nor it doesn't appear as if the casino seemed to notice it because they didn't object. But now, Mr. Speaker, it's being phased in. Its final effect in July. Minister of Tourism and Culture over there says it's been phased in. You know, Mr. Speaker, it's being phased in now for almost full 2 years. And nobody, if you get a Minister of Tourism calls from Cape Breton, could you tell me, do you have a letter from them? Do you have correspondence from the casinos that are saying, oh, this is devastating our business? And can you table something, provide us a piece of paper to show us how they are saying it is hurting them? And guess what that contract has? The contract with the casinos, it has an arbitration clause in it. And so if they decide that they're being harshly treated by the government of Nova Scotia, they can grieve it and go to arbitration. Now, the Minister of Finance, of course, when he was introducing the bill, we had a friendly little chit-chat across the floor. Well, he said it wasn't that friendly, Mr. Speaker. Let's put it this way. It was more like I got up in a couple points of order, and the minister responded to my points of order. My points of order were really like questions. And he was saying, Mr. Speaker, that their legal opinions were that the casino could turn around and say that imposing the anti-smoking or the non-smoking policy in the casino would harm their business, and they could give termination, announce that they're canceling the contract within 30 days. Now, of course, Mr. Speaker, there is an arbitration process. And if we remember the whole issues that went before arbitration before, they didn't happen within 30 days. The arbitration dragged out for months, and in fact, I think in one case, well over a year. And you know, Mr. Speaker, the legal opinion that the Minister of Finance referred to, and which of course he told me he wouldn't table, didn't come from government lawyers. They didn't come from an independent legal firm hired to give advice looking at the contract. The legal opinion was given by the Nova Scotia Gaming Corporation. Now, we should remember what the responsibility of the Nova Scotia Gaming Corporation is. The responsibility, their job, is to maximize the number of loonies and toonies flowing into the pockets of the government of Nova Scotia from the casino. They're in charge of maximizing profits from gambling, Mr. Speaker. That's what their job is. So do you think that that is an independent body that you should be asking for legal advice? I mean, conceivably, yes, having a no-smoking policy in the casino might reduce the profits from gambling by a few dollars, Mr. Speaker. But I certainly haven't seen any evidence that it would cause the casino to walk away from any kind of a profitable operation. And it's not, Mr. Speaker, as if there aren't other casinos in North America. In fact, there are quite a few of them, Mr. Speaker, that do not permit smoking in those facilities. So, Mr. Speaker, I don't buy for a minute that they're going to run and hide. It might slightly reduce the take from the government, which is addicted to gambling, but it's certainly, Mr. Speaker, I think it's stretching it to the extreme to suggest that the casino, with its monopoly, is going to be hitching up its team and hauling out of town. It just ain't going to happen. But you know what will happen, Mr. Speaker? We will have a yet even more uneven playing field. We have, for example, in downtown Halifax, many facilities, many bars and entertainment facilities that people go to. And you know, those facilities are all going to be smoke-free. So those who like to smoke, Mr. Speaker, and who are unwilling to go out for a night on the town and give up the smoking completely, if they have a choice, those people will be migrating away from the other clubs in downtown Halifax and around to migrate to the casino so they can have a cigarette. And that, of course, might have the added benefit to the government of being able to get a few more loonies and toonies flowing into your one-armed bandits. So what you're doing, in effect, by exempting the casino, is giving the casino a competitive advantage aimed at increasing the gambling revenues flowing into the province of Nova Scotia. And I wonder, Mr. Speaker, and I would invite the Minister of Finance, the Premier, or any member of the Tory benches, show me wrong, prove me wrong, put something out there, put some evidence out there, something, anything that would disprove my cynical view that what is really motivating you is an opportunity to maximize your gambling profits. But you know, I'm not hearing a single soul on the other side even beginning to challenge me. Not even the member from Kings North. But maybe that will appear in an article in the Daily News saying how socially responsible it is to have smoking in the casinos, just as it's socially responsible to give those who are the most disadvantaged nothing in the tax breaks, despite the fact they pay taxes every time they go to the stores, buying children's clothing for themselves, you name it, life insurance, Mr. Speaker. They get nothing. Could you tell me how much time I have left? Ooh, time is gone. Of course, by unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker, the members of the House, including the government members, could decide to give me more time. But you know, Mr. Speaker, I'd even be willing to give up my last 5 minutes if the Minister of Community Services was willing to get to his feet and address how he will resolve the issue that's going on outside and tell us about the strategy to get people back to the bargaining table, have arbitration. You know, Mr. Speaker, that would be wonderful, but he'll have his time anyway to get up and speak on this bill. But certainly hope that we will be hearing something in that regard, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, I honestly, I look at this legislation, this bill. And, Mr. Speaker, it's nothing more than a veiled attempt to curry the favor of voters, to try to make Nova Scotians forget about all of the things that you haven't done. Minister of Finance, as my colleague, my leader, pointed out, and as the Auditor General has said, the debt of Nova Scotia, the deficit should be increased by $500 million to reflect the increased costs or the future costs to repair school buildings in this province that have been allowed to deteriorate, Mr. Speaker, because of deferred maintenance. But that didn't happen. I will say the one thing that they did put on the books a number of years ago were funds, they haven't spent it yet, but they did put on the books to show an increase in the debt, the cost to do cleanup in the Sydney tar ponds. But to my friends in the Liberal caucus, they would know this quite well, they did that in such a way as to make it reflect on the books from the former government to make them look worse when they were going out, and to get that off the books, put it on the Liberal government books, rather than put it on the Tory government books, because that wouldn't look good for them. But they won't put the deferred school maintenance on it, Mr. Speaker. Nor will they put on the books other known costs that are just being pushed off, Mr. Speaker. But they will come up with hundreds of millions of dollars worth of election goody promises that are going to be fulfilled in year 1, 2, 3, or whatever, sometime out there in the future. They talk about being fiscally responsible as they continue to increase revenues, raking in more and more from today's Nova Scotia families who are struggling, taking that in all the hidden ways, increased fees, increased service charges, raking it in off of taxes as insurance, as I pointed out earlier, that has gone up by 66% in the last year, and the province, of course, takes in 4% of that. That's millions of dollars. But they want to look good as they go to the elections. They talk about how they're going to be cutting about 3,000 people who pay in Nova Scotia now pay income tax, but after the budget is passed next year, they won't pay a cent. Those are people, I'm glad they won't, because they shouldn't be. That's positive. But, Mr. Speaker, those are people who are paying marginal taxes at all right now. $5, $10, $20, $25 a year. A lot less than the $155. And certainly it doesn't begin to compare what a 10% or 9.2% tax break is going to mean to somebody who's making $1 million a year in this province. And we have those families, Mr. Speaker. We have those families. It's just, honestly, Mr. Speaker, it's out of whack. And I've been a little bit harsh on government members in some ways, I feel like this evening as I've been talking. Because I've talked to a lot of Tory members, Mr. Speaker, and you talk to them.
What are they saying, John?
They aren't bad folks.
What are they saying to you?
But you know what, Mr. Speaker? They, I don't think, have really thought through what's happening. And maybe it's time that they do think it through and go back and tell the Minister of Finance and the Premier and those who are behind the scenes pulling their strings as the election appears. Let's back off and do it right. And let's not be so heavy-handed on those, Mr. Speaker, who we should be trying to help. I think you're moving forward in your seat to tell me my time has expired, so I'll take my seat.
Member Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad to have an opportunity to speak to this bill. I got to say that to follow my colleague from Sackville-Cobequid doesn't make my job any easier. But I want to tell you, Mr. Speaker, I want to tell the members on the opposite side of the House that in 5 years of being in this House, that yet I'm not a cynic. Now, Nova Scotians may well be, but when it comes to the experiences that I've had here, I recognize what it is to have power. And I didn't expect the Tory government to use that power differently than they have. This has been a Mike Harris government in many ways, and they're going to try to go to the polls and tell the people, I think very soon, that, and the Premier will be saying that we did what we said we were going to do, Mr. Speaker. And that's what Mike Harris did to try to get reelected for his second term. And it worked. And I think the Premier thinks that by following Mike Harris's plan that it'll work for him. But I think the Premier has underestimated that the times have changed in 5 years. And Nova Scotians are not as gullible as they were the first time around. But Nova Scotians were looking for change, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians would like to have a government that finally makes decisions based on its people, all of its people. This government has not done that, Mr. Speaker. It has made its decisions based on a few, and it still caters to a few. It's said that Tory times are tough times. Well, that's true, Mr. Speaker. but it's not tough on everybody. There's a certain group of people or a certain class of people in Nova Scotia that Tory times are good times.
Who are they, John?
Because they get the advantages of Tory government.
Who are they, John?
The Sobeys, number one, first off the mark. In 1999, they were given a tax roll or tax payroll rebate and for $3 million. Now, the RRSS, who are here today, Mr. Speaker, are asking for arbitration. Do you know why the government won't go to arbitration, Mr. Speaker?
Why is that?
Because they think the arbitrator will agree with those people. That's why they won't go. This government has been burned every time it's gone to arbitration. It doesn't matter whether it's been paramedics, it doesn't matter whether it's been nurses, but these are the people that the government has chosen to abuse. Mr. Risley's company that creates nutraceuticals, fish oil, etc., got a break on their loan payments. I think, if I remember right, $6 million or maybe even more. Now, the people in this House today, to settle their dispute with the government, it would take $5 million. But that's not worth it to the government. Now, I don't know what it is that the Tories think that people do with their money. Matter of fact, I often wonder, when they go to their communities, when they go out and talk to people on the street in their communities, what is it about their world that is so different from the world of everybody else? Don't they expect that these people will take their paychecks and spend the money in their communities and return that money back into the economy? Or do they think they'll bury it in a hole in the backyard, that somehow it'll be lost forever, Mr. Speaker?
I don't think so, John.
Well, I think they're going to spend it. I think those people have needs and dreams and hopes and families, and they use their job like everybody else uses their job to try to achieve those dreams, to try to get them from point A to point B, to cover 5 years, 10 years, 25 years down the road, so they can make their plans, Mr. Speaker, and move their family forward. And I know some of the people who are involved, and actually there's a group home in my constituency in Lance. It's been there for 20 plus years, but they're not unionized. And the people who work there don't have a pension. I don't know what their thoughts are. I know they're worried, Mr. Speaker. They're worried about themselves, but they're more worried about the residents there. They haven't had a budget. They haven't known their budget that they're going to operate that group home with since 1994, Mr. Speaker. They haven't had a budget given to them by the government to work with since 1994. We're coming up to 10 years. And they haven't known what their budget is going to be from year to year. They run deficits up to $50,000. Community Services will give them a lump of money to eradicate the deficit, and then they'll go on for another part of a year and run up another deficit. They run their group home out of a line of credit, you might as well say, at the bank. Now, that wasn't initiated by this government, Mr. Speaker. That was initiated by the previous Liberal government. But this group over here, Mr. Speaker, they had a chance to change that when they came in 99. Weren't interested in doing that. Now, I know right now that the Lance Group Homes van, which they used to carry the residents into programs, because there's corridor community options in Enfield, which has programs for the residents there. And they use that van to carry the residents to programs. Well, that van won't pass inspection. It can't. It's wore out. They need a new one. And they've been after Community Services to let them know what's happening around their budget so they can make some plan, because if that vehicle shuts down, the whole system shuts down there.
What's Community Service saying?
Community Service isn't saying anything.
What?
These people live in those homes with the residents. They take care of them. They take them to funerals. They take them shopping. They take them to their programs. They live there. You have to commit a lot of yourself to carry out this job, Mr. Speaker. you have to commit in the most unselfish way to people who are unable to take care of themselves. And you have to restructure your life around their lives. Now, that's asking a lot. And there's very few people in this world who are willing to do that, and who are willing to do it for the pay that this government's willing to pay them. I want to tell the minister they're worth more. Now, if you think you're right, if you think they're not worth more, then why not go to arbitration if you're so sure? If you're so sure that you can win, if you're so sure that you're right, why not go to arbitration and let an arbitrator decide? And I want to say to the minister, do you actually believe that $5 million is going to break the bank for this province when the Premier can give out $68 million in $155 checks? I don't think that should be a problem, Mr. Speaker. We always seem to be able to find money for somebody who doesn't really need it. $9 million to Arenda Recip to create airplane engines in Debert. A company out of Mississauga, Ontario. Well, these are people who are here in Nova Scotia now, committed to this province and the lives of the people here. So why don't they rate? Why aren't they worth as much as strangers from away? Because you can't put that on a news release or a ministerial statement and think you're going to get as many votes, I guess. Make an announcement about a few jobs that never show up, and that seems to be worth something to this government. I heard my honourable colleague from Sackville-Cobequid, Mr. Speaker. He talked about the members on the opposite side, how some of them were good people. And I think he's probably right. Matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, I think a lot of the members on the Tory side are good people. If you get them alone, have a chat, you can find they're almost as good as New Democrats. And Mr. Speaker, I think if we can convince the people in their constituencies that these are good people, I think we can try to convince them to keep them home in the next election and let them do their good in the community and send someone else here to represent them. That, I think, would be a good plan, Mr. Speaker. Because the members on the opposite side aren't here to represent everyone. They're only here to represent a few. You know, Mr. Speaker, it's become an interesting world lately. And we hear about globalization. It seems that what happens at home is not really as important as what's happening somewhere else. Corporations are wanting to come in from other jurisdictions. They want to be able to work and avoid the laws of any sovereign nation. Your labor laws and your pollution laws or environmental laws don't have to apply to them. But it seems that everywhere you look, someone is at the mercy of someone else. And I'm always amazed at what people will do to other people just because they can. And Mr. Speaker, that's what this government is doing. It is really not willing to sit down with Nova Scotians who are offering a service and have done that with goodwill for the people that they care about. But you can't do the job that the people in the RRSS do without caring. You can't go to work every day without caring about the people you serve. So why is it that the government can treat them as badly as it is just because it can do it? No, they don't care. Now, Mr. Speaker, this Financial Measures Act, or an act respecting certain financial measures, is one that has a few interesting points, and I And I want to say that the Minister of Finance, he won't be back to the House after this next election, and so certainly the impact of this bill, he won't be around for that or to take the abuse. And actually, I'm hoping that if there's any abuse for the members on the opposite side, it'll be that they're on this side after the next election. If there's any of them to come back, because as both my previous colleagues have spoken, and as well as our financial critic, this budget isn't balanced. There was a lot that hasn't been put on the books, and the government is aware of that. The Auditor General is aware of it, and there's been enough downloading from the federal government to the province, to the municipalities, and by the province, again, through school boards, to district health authorities, that it's obvious that we are working under a deficit. Now, we have a monetary deficit in terms of the infrastructure problems in schools, maintenance that's been deferred up to a level of $500 million. We have a social deficit in terms of how people have been abused by this government, how Nova Scotians have paid and paid and paid through the nose since this government came into power, and John Ham said no new taxes. Well, I think one of the first ones was the 911 fee. But you know, I heard the honourable member from Cape Breton West, I think, stand and question my leader when he raised this. And my memory, if it's right, back in 99, if that was when that happened, 99 or 2000, I forget the year, that the Tories brought in the fee on 911 calls. But Mr. Speaker, I think it was actually the honourable member from Cape Breton West who was sitting somewhere in this area, because the Liberal caucus was in this place at that time, and our caucus was there. And I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that the honourable member from Cape Breton West stood in his place and he raised this issue. He railed at the government and said, how can you do that? How can you bring in that fee? It's unjust, it's unfair. And I remember the then Minister of Health, the member for Truro Bible Hill, he stood and held up a piece of paper and said, you signed it before you left. Now, that seemed to quiet the honourable member from Cape Breton West considerably. But I want to say, Mr. Speaker, the Tories didn't have to go through with it. But anything that they were able to do that made it harder for Nova Scotians, they've done it. And I want to give you an example, Mr. Speaker. And this is something I think members opposite can relate to, because I couldn't believe it when I was approached recently at a breakfast put on by the Lions Club in Milford, in my constituency. And one of the gentlemen going around pouring coffee or pouring tea in the morning, he said to me, when you go back, will you mention to your finance critic that 2 years ago, when we applied for a license for our bingos, it was $50. Last year it was $150. This year it's $300. Now, this is a non-profit organization, Mr. Speaker, trying to do work in its community and actually doing good work in the community. But this is an example of how not just Nova Scotians going about their everyday business have been stung by this government, but this is an example of how this government has targeted everyone, especially those doing volunteer work. And if it was thought that somebody was making 5 cents, Mr. Speaker, then they were targeted. There was an action taken to ensure that part of that, probably 3 cents of 5 cents, was going back to the government. But the government would feel good now, actually, I think, these days, because they're going to spend $68 million to buy the votes of Nova Scotians. Well,
What are you saying, John?
I'm really glad that I'm around to witness this.
What's going to happen? Tell us what's going to happen.
Because I think this government is going to get an education like it hasn't gotten in a long time. It's going to get a lesson on the lack of respect that it has for Nova Scotians.
How stupid do you think we are?
So the question of who do they think they're kidding, I think nobody. There's nobody that I've talked to that is impressed by the $155 handout. Now, the Premier says, well, I said I was going to do it and I'm going to do it. Now, the Premier said he was going to give a 10% tax break. Now, unless everybody makes the same wage, I can't see how everybody's going to get $155 if that represents the start of the 10% tax break. But I'm sure there was a lot of number crunching before the government ever made any announcement about that. And I would be really curious to know, Mr. Speaker, what the government's plan is on this, because I would think that even the members opposite must be realizing in their communities that this is not going to pay. Other people say, oh, I'll take the check, and I'm going to spend it, but I'm not voting for the Tories. Yes, it's going to backfire, as my honourable colleague from Timberley Prospect tells me. I think it is going to backfire, and I wouldn't be surprised if at some point there'll be some backpedaling before we ever get to that date. But the government's done its work. I think they realize that this isn't going to cost them exactly $68 million. As our member from Halifax Fairview, our finance critic, has stated, it's really going to cost the government about $40 million because they're going to get some of that back through bracket creep and the freezing of the personal exemption. So the government's done its work to say, okay, here's what we want, here's what we're going to spend, so here's the payoff at the end of it. So it's weighing the dollar value compared to what the upside is going to be. But I don't think they've actually calculated what the downside is going to be. So, would you be able to sell to Nova Scotians that this government has been a government, a tax government? Well, probably not. I think Nova Scotians aren't aware that they're taking in an additional $74 million in personal taxes. Not to mention an increase in corporate taxes, another $70 million. So from $200 million last year to $270 million this year, and I expect that that hasn't been raised and flagged and discussed, and no ministerial statement about that one, and certainly not presented to the Chamber of Commerce. But I got to say that this government doesn't deviate from its plans much. In other words, earlier in their mandate, I thought when they took the money away from charities, I thought, boy, that was the dumbest move I've ever seen. But you know, Mr. Speaker, that was only the start of dumb moves. But I thought it was stupidity. It wasn't. It was a plan. It was a stupid plan. But I just thought they didn't realize. They weren't really aware of the impact of what they were doing. But they weren't worried about the impact of what they were doing. They were doing it. And they were going to attack the people that either they thought would have the least impact on their re-election, or that the rest of society would kind of slough them off and say, well, it doesn't matter anyway. But they were thinking something, Mr. Speaker. I mean, there was a plan. And time again, whether it was the paramedics or the nurses or now this residential society, it's just been one hit after another on the people of Nova Scotia, and they would refer to these people as interest groups. Nurses would be an interest group. These workers who were in the gallery today or in this building today, they'd be an interest group. Even the people paying these high rates in auto insurance, they'd be an interest group. Well, gee, I think that most people that I know, if you're 16 and older, you have automobile insurance. Well, that's a pretty darn large interest group, Mr. Speaker. It's a pretty large group to try to slough it off and say they don't matter. And that's actually what the government's announcement today indicates. They really weren't interested in dealing with the issue of auto insurance. But this is a serious flaw in their plan, because as much as they won't go against big business, they're sending that message to Nova Scotians over and over again that they're willing to let business gouge them so the government can get a benefit. And that, I think, will be the undoing of this government. They've tried it with seniors and long-term care facilities, and I have to say that I'm amazed at the Band-Aid approach that the government has taken. If it wasn't raised by this caucus and this party, there would have been nothing done by the government on these issues, but yet to do so little. I can't believe that the approach that this government would take to the long-term care issue was to leave it at 2007. To do the assessment of the people going into these facilities to go back 2 years instead of 3. I mean, what this government has done in terms of changing the process to benefit seniors has been zilch, Mr. Speaker. And it's been so difficult for the government to defend it. I can't understand why they did it. But even under pressure, even with 19,000 signatures, Mr. Speaker, this government was not willing to back down. And that is what has amazed me. That in the face of mounting opposition, when it actually could mean the difference between government or not, this government was willing to gamble with the people. And gamble that we wouldn't be able to get the message out to the people. Well, no wonder they've gotten in bed with the casino if they're going to gamble at those odds. Because, Mr. Speaker, this affects people's lives every day, where they live. It's taken money out of their pockets. And people are starting to recognize that. If you go to the bank and get $100, it seems like it's gone before you get out the door, Mr. Speaker. And Nova Scotians are noticing this. Money goes nowhere today. And the government has had a large part in seeing that it goes nowhere unless it goes to their friends or to them. And Nova Scotians are tired of that. And they are looking for a change. And I'm going to tell you this, Mr. Speaker, this party is willing to offer them that change. And we're going to. Now, let's take a look at the legislation before us and the government's attempt to protect the casino operators. Now, Mr. Speaker, I wasn't in this House when the casino deal was signed. I, probably like most Nova Scotians, saw the news stories. Even I was amazed at what the government at the time, the Liberal government, was willing to do, what concessions it was willing to make for the casino operators. Matter of fact, I'm amazed that the businesses downtown here didn't raise more of a fuss, because it was a disadvantage to them. That casino was given a break every which way that other businesses in the area were never given. And actually, the casino got a competitive edge over local business. But now, when the HRM brings in a bylaw that's going to impact those businesses regarding smoking, the government jumps to its feet to bring in legislation to protect the casino, even without the request of the casino. Now, that's even more amazing. As my leader earlier said, this has got to be the only province in the country that actually brought in legislation to continue smoking, which is unheard of, especially brought in by a doctor who's a premier. Now, if Nova Scotians were to ever wonder who it is that this government works for, they should know by now it's not for them. This is not a government that is in any way at all interested in doing what it can to ensure that Nova Scotians are taken care of, to ensure that they have a few extra dollars in their pocket, that Nova Scotia families, working families, have a benefit to their government, to know that decisions that are made by their government are done on their behalf, Mr. Speaker. And they have come to realize that, and they're going to realize it more in the next few days or few weeks, and I expect that the members on the opposite side will have a chance to debate their party's record and their vision of the future, whatever that might be, on the doorsteps in their constituencies. And if they can defend this government's record, then it's going to have to be without giving the people on the doorstep all the facts, or denying the facts, one or the other, because nobody can go to Nova Scotians and defend the record of this government and how it's abused the people in this province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would have liked to see some changes in this legislation. I would have liked to see the government's budget actually take into account my constituency a little more. I would have liked to have seen this $68 million go to roads. And I'm not asking the government to spend it all in my constituency, but I'd like to see them spend 1/52nd of it in my constituency, which I think would have given me over $1 million anyway, that we could have used to address problems that have not been addressed for some time. And I think it's unfair for the people in my constituency to have to do without simply because this government wants to bribe them with their own money. Mr. Speaker, how am I doing for time, or is there an issue of time here?
The member has until 8:26.
8:26. I'm going longer than I anticipated. I think maybe that was your point.
Just keep going. You're making a lot of sense. A lot of sense.
So, also, Mr. Speaker, I mentioned the other day about my constituency being part of the Northern Health Board or Northern Health District, and I am quite pleased to see that the members in the other constituencies that are part of that district seem to have been able to get some money spent by the province in their area. A new hospital in Amherst, a planned new hospital in Truro, a new facility in Tatamagouche, and but nothing in Hants East, Mr. Speaker. And actually, the District Health Authority has agreed that it'll put some of its facilities that are presently in my constituency, blood collection, etc., that they're willing to move those into one facility if the municipality will build it. During budget estimates, I questioned the minister, and she said, well, we may build that. Well, I haven't heard anything to indicate that that's a for sure. The District Health Authority met in my community, had a meeting in my community the other evening, and they certainly didn't offer that the province, or that they were willing to build that with money from the province. And I think that considering that my constituency is part of that District Health Authority, where so much money, provincial money, has been spent in other constituencies, and I think it would only be fair to spend the money that they're asking the municipality to spend to build this facility in East Hants. And I want to tell you, Mr. Speaker, I think it's the cheapest. It'll be the least amount of money that's been spent in those constituencies compared to what's been spent or planned to be spent by the government in those constituencies that are held by Tory members. And we certainly have the population. In the corridor area, we have 10,000 people. I think there's about 6,000 in the Tatamagouche area where they're building a new facility. And I would say we have almost twice that population in that section of my constituency who could actually make use of of a really top-notch facility. And even they know they're not going to get everything they want, but they're willing to start with something and then build toward more over time. And I think it's unfair of the government to expect the taxpayers, municipal taxpayers, to pick up the tab for that facility. Well, Mr. Speaker, with those comments, I'll wind up. I want to tell the members opposite that there's so much in this bill that's bad. They could have redone their budget and actually used the budget to actually indicate what the state of the province's financial situation was, to use conventional accounting practices or whatever the term that they use. Certainly doesn't account for the $500 million in deferred maintenance on the schools in this province, and that's something that nobody can escape from. And I know that the people of Nova Scotia deserve to get a better account.